Welcome back, Curious Hearts. I'm Vera. Together, in every episode, we get to explore what it is we really believe, how we practice, and we get to meet people who are on their own spiritual path. Together, we begin. Hi, y'all. Welcome. I am really excited to have this conversation today with Court Von Lindern. Court and I met actually in an online course, and they shared with me, like they shared just in a chat, right, that they were, doing some spiritual direction, and I was like, wait, tell me more. I want to hear more about what you're doing. And so we've had at least one other conversation before this. I'm just really excited to be able to share another and different adventure path. So Court is a spiritual director and a queer theologian, and I'm not going to tell you anything else. Uh, but I'd love, if there's anything that you want to share, Court, before we start, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for making the connection. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, you already said it. I'm a spiritual director and queer theologian living in Montana, where I was born and raised. And I really look at spiritual direction or spiritual accompaniment as just helping folks cultivate a relationship with God, spirit, divine, whatever they call the sacred in their lives. And yeah, I'm excited to get into our conversation and share more as we go along. And yeah, it just feels really
Yeah,
good to be here and be connected.
yeah, I love it. Excuse me. So we'll begin at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about your spiritual and or religious life when you were growing up in your family.
Yeah. So I grew up in Northwest Montana, going to a United Methodist Church. My immediate family, like my parents and my sister, who's quite a bit older than me, we didn't really have like I wouldn't say our family was particularly super religious. But my dad's side of the family, we all lived in the same place. Everybody was really close, and it was really important for my grandma, paternal grandma in particular, for all of us to like be involved in church in some way. And so my kind of relationship to church and religion at the time was like, this is the thing that we just do because the rest of the family is doing it. And so I grew up in a really small little United Methodist Church again in Northwest Montana, and I think I just kind of found myself involved, not somewhat by choice, somewhat just by kind of expectation of the family. The church itself was pretty open. United Methodists, the Wesleyan kind of theology is this concept of prevenient grace. And so, all of us being all of us having access to God's unconditional love. And so that was kind of the theology that I was just like given when I was growing up is like God loves you for who you are, God created for who you are, and God loves you. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Mm.
Um, and so again, my immediate family, we weren't super religious ourselves, but just spending a lot of time in the church. I grew up going to youth group, was really important to me. And then I would say most of my kind of faith and spirituality after that was really shaped at church camp. And so I also went to a United Methodist church camp on Flathead Lake. And that was, again, another place where my camp counselors in particular really kind of, drove home this like, God is love, God loves you for who you are. And they also really invited a lot of questions. And that's something that I think that maybe in my family in particular, we didn't like explore a lot of like conversations. Like, I actually think I was probably the most like spiritual in my like immediate family.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really talk a whole lot about God. But so I just had a lot of encouragement to ask questions from a very young age through my pastors at church, through I would say kind of my youth group leaders. My youth group leaders were my mom, my aunt, and then some of the other kind of parents around. Like it was a
Oh
very kind of
God,
like volunteer operation.
it's so funny because right, like I was in youth group as a kid, not associated at all with my family, right, and part of it was like the cool kids, the people I wanted to hang out with were at youth
Sure.
group,
Yeah.
and like my parents weren't anywhere near the church for lots of different reasons. I'm really curious. I have never been to that part of the country.
Yeah.
Will you tell me what Northwest Montana is like?
Yeah. Absolutely. So it's It's interesting. It's really beautiful, really gorgeous landscape. Glacier National Park is kind of what I would consider my backyard, in a way, growing up.
Mm,
And yeah, the smaller town that I grew up in particular, was very much a working class kind of town. Yeah, aluminum plant for a long time was there, and a logging kind of company, for quite some time. So yeah, blue collar working families. Um, it's a little bit more conservative. I think that well, shifted like a little bit here and there, kind of like depending. Whenever I go back home, I'm kind of surprised at like, especially around queerness, like how much more visibility and little bits of acceptance there are. But it is a little bit more
mm,
conservative. It is an area, in the Flathead Valley, where there is admittedly a pretty high like white supremacy, kind of population. So it's a pretty mixed bag. And then when we get into Whitefish, Montana, there's a lot more like affluence in the area. So very kind of resort ski kind of town. So yeah, it's very mixed in terms of a lot of working class people. And then we kind of have, especially in these days in Montana, a lot of out of state wealthy interests kind of moving in. And so we kind of have this
yeah.
interesting class dynamic, going on as well. But the landscape is, super gorgeous.
Yeah.
Yeah, Montana as a state only has like a million people in it, so we're like a small
Right.
town in of ourselves.
Like, right.
Yeah,
Like the whole state is a small town. I mean, I feel like there's so many assumptions that get made about a
yeah,
place like Montana. But like the thing that you described that I find really interesting is like for whatever reason the word that comes forward is rugged, right? It's like
mm,
you're in this like natural landscape, right? Really beautiful, but also very working class.
mm-hmm,
Um, maybe not a lot of people. Like I had a friend and colleague who grew up in Colorado, and I forget exactly the way how he described it, but sort of this like the frontier
yeah,
energy, right?
yeah,
Like there's a lot of sense of like independence, right? Like
yes,
that rugged independence that is like really proud, right? Like really
mm-hmm,
like self-reliant. And so it's also interesting to think about the way that spirituality moves with relationship to that.
mm-hmm,
Anyway, that's
mm-hmm,
just a thought.
yeah,
So
yeah.
so yeah, so like so that's the religious side. Like how would you experience, like you said you were probably the most spiritual in your family.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? Like what was your relationship like with your sibling, with your parents? Like were they just like, what are you doing?
Yeah, they weren't necessarily like, yeah, like, what are you doing? I think they were like, oh, like, I think that they were kind of like excited that I was, committed, like, right, like I was fine going to church. I mean, not that I was like always like stoked about it as a kid. It still felt kind of like an obligation and a responsibility. But I think it gave me like something to do. I think from my parents' side of things, they're like, oh, this is gonna keep Court out of trouble. Not that I was ever like really, wasn't really quote unquote like a troubled kid, like whatever. Getting
But just
into like,
busy.
yeah, I was just like
Yeah.
busy, just yeah, committed to youth group, to all these things. And I think it just kind of gave me a lot of like leadership opportunities too.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would volunteer. And my grandma, still does, but she ran the food bank, in Columbia Falls growing up. And so from a very young age too, I was kind of like really, yeah, involved with just like the service aspect of, expressing my faith. And that's also a very like United Methodist kind of, tenet of this idea of like Methodists are who we are because we have like methods to our faith. Like we do, our faith is in action.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so as far as like the conversations went, we never really like had a lot of like talk about God, and talk about spirit. When it came to me going to church camp, I was like a really shy kid in elementary school, at a younger age, and I kind of used to follow, my cousin who was a year older than me around at camp. And there was a year when, she had moved up to the like next age level camp, and so I was going to be at camp alone. And I remember like the 45-minute drive to camp, just like begging for my parents to like turn the car around, like I didn't want to go.
Hmm.
And they kind of made the decision, like, we're going to leave you. And I remember my dad like throwing my bags on the porch and like, or on my bunk, and saying, like, we'll see you at the end of the weekend. And I imagine that was like a hard decision for them to make as parents, of like, ooh, did we just like kind of low key traumatize our kid and like leave them like totally hanging. And then of course by the end of the week I was like crying to like not go home.
Yeah.
And so I think at the end of the day they were like really grateful that, they had encouraged and kind of helped me like, yeah, kind of find this space that I was excited about. Yeah, and I remember too this memory of like reading. I decided as a kid I was going to read the Bible at some point, and I was reading, I think, either the book of Genesis or the book of Exodus, and I was probably like 10 years old, so it wasn't super exciting by any means. And I remember my mom kind of being like poking her head in my room. She's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm just like reading Exodus or Genesis or something like that." And she thought she misheard me and thought I was reading some sort of like Stephen King book. And she was like, "That's like not age appropriate for you." But once it like clear that up, yeah, right. She was like, "Where did you get that? Like, what do you mean?" And I was like, "Mom, like, what are you talking about? I'm reading the Bible." And she was like, "Oh, okay." So yeah, in terms of, yeah, so we really didn't have a lot of conversations, but just a lot of like, I think they just kind of let it be and like affirmed like, okay, like this is what Court enjoys. This is something that like, yeah, seems to um yeah, give Court a little bit of like excitement and purpose and meaning. And I think, yeah, just watching from like the leadership side too. And I think that when I, especially after like camp kind of like came out of my shell a lot more, I think they're like, oh, this is like a really great space, really great thing that we have going for our kid. And I think now they're actually a little surprised of kind of where I've ended up and how like, they're like, yeah, in terms of just like political views and differences a little bit in our relationship, they're kind of, I think it's kind of funny because it is a little bit like, well, you brought me to church and like you shouldn't like, right, like this is kind of how that happened. Yeah, love thy neighbor, all these things. So yeah, and so I think that's been the most interesting is they're kind of like a little bit of surprise of where I've ended up now of like how did this happen? I'm like, well, you brought me to church from a young age. We shouldn't be all that
exactly.
like shocked about
you
it.
You instilled these values in me, and so this is like the natural outcome. Okay, so that then seems like a good question. Is like, where are you now? Like, what does your spiritual life look like as an adult, and what was maybe the journey to get there?
Yeah. I know I've said it a bunch of times, but I think, yeah, just the church camp I went to really played a significant role in shaping my faith and spirituality, especially from that place of being able to ask questions, and then also getting to witness and experience God in spirit, in nature, in landscape. Flathead Lake being on, yeah, Salish and Kootenai land, and just being like a really sacred, beautiful place. And that was just, yeah, there was just so much like appreciation and gratitude built into our camp programming just around like, yeah, like let's like engage God, let's engage spirit with like the land that we're on, and the water that we're near. And I remember a couple of moments of yeah, sitting in like a session at camp with one of our counselors giving like, I don't entirely remember what the talk was about, other than like talking about new life and all these things, and all of a sudden it started raining outside and it was still like sunny, so we kind of had that sweet little like magical sunny rainfall happening. And she paused in the middle of her talk and she said like, look, like there's magic happening like outside like right now, and just kind of like really drawing my and others' attention to like the magic that I think is spirit that surrounds us. And then similarly, another year, I remember another counselor, a fellow camper, I didn't know him super well, had died in a car accident, and we were reading his obituary in our like little small group, and we were sitting outside, and as she was reading it, this like little yellow monarch butterfly just kind of like came and like hung out with us, and she paused in the middle of this reading and said, oh, like, hello, Logan. And again, like another kind of moment of where I really felt like my like attention was drawn to like, oh, like God and spirit isn't just this like white bearded man in the sky like above us. Like God and spirit is like here, like with us, and like there's like, yeah, there's magic all around, and we can like tap into this. And so yeah, and so I think I would say that like continued through into like, yeah, my like adulthood and coming of age. And I remember going into college, and I, yeah, would go back to volunteer council at the camp each year. And as like any young college student, I was like trying to find my way through like different spiritual practices, and I wasn't feeling like super stoked about Christianity, right? Like I didn't want to go like sit in church, sit in the pews. I attended some of the campus ministry stuff, but it didn't quite like resonate with me. So I, yeah, looked to yoga a little bit. I looked to, right, like so, like borderline new age stuff of like, oh, like the rocks and the crystals and like all these other kind of things, but just never quite like yeah, I think I just had a hard time finding, right, like that like foundation, in which I feel like I got a little bit of like growing up in the church of kind of like, yeah, engaging with scripture and religious texts, even though I was still a little like, I don't really know how I feel about this like Christianity thing. Um, I still don't know how I feel about this
Yeah, that was my
Christianity
next question. I know. I was like,
thing.
how do you feel about it? I mean, it's so interesting because what you were describing, I was like, oh, I forget about. I had this like really, I may still even have it, like really cool, like illustrated book of Bible stories that was
Hmm.
like tall and skinny. And it was definitely like designed for children. And we had a copy of the Bible. And I remember at some point, like being in
Yeah,
probably a little bit older than you were, but like sitting down to read the Bible just to be like, what was I doing? I have no idea. Um, but getting to the part in Genesis where it's like so and so begot so and then so and so begot, and I was like, this is boring, and I
yeah,
just
exactly.
quit.
Like going through
Right?
the
I was sort of
genealogy, and you're
like,
like, I can't do it.
yeah, I'm like, I don't really. This is, and he lived for how many years? Like, I don't actually. Okay, I just like closed it. So yeah, it's like it seems really reasonable, like in that time of your life to be in a search, right? To be
Yeah,
in a like, okay, well maybe this thing that I grew up with isn't the only thing. Are there some other options? And I think so often in the conversations I've had with people, not just in the podcast, but everywhere, there's a lot of like, oh, this thing that I grew up with is actually not the thing.
hmm,
And that you sort of came full circle in a really interesting way. Um,
hmm.
yeah. Will you talk about your? I mean, this is not a podcast about religiousness, which
Totally.
I just want to acknowledge. We know that, but like, will you talk about what your experience of Methodism is? Like the Methodist Church and like what the
Yeah, yeah. I can do my best. Yeah, I think, I mean, right, like it is at the end of the day, like it is like it's the foundation of like where my faith started.
hmm,
When I think of Methodism, I think of like the things that I really value from it are, and in like the United Methodist Church in particular, are connectionalism, which is just like we're all deeply connected. It's like not rare to like bump into somebody, get into a conversation. They're like, oh, I'm like a United Methodist and I go to this church in this state. And you're like, oh, okay. And then like you like throw out like three different names and eventually you get to like, you make a connection. And so we're just so deeply connected as a denomination. And that's something that I think is incredibly like unique for the United Methodist Church. And so that's like, yeah, I think really fun, really sweet. And then also, yeah, coming back to um, the Wesleyan theology, and John Wesley is considered the founder of the United Methodist Church. And I have a lot of, yeah, right. I'm always going to wrestle with like church fathers and like all these people that like, yeah, like we kind of lived up in history. But that idea of prevenient grace in particular, of this like God's love is offered to us, each of us, unconditionally. Like it's just like it's just there. It's waiting for you. God's always here waiting for you. All you have to do is like turn to God and accept it. There's like really nothing else. That's it. I think that's a little easier said than done. Maybe more so like, yeah, speaking for myself. And so I think when I think of kind of like the United Methodist Church as like this institution, I do really struggle with institutionalized religion. And that has been a big part of my own path. I did, yeah, go to seminary, and with the intention ish. I knew very early on that I actually didn't want to be ordained and I didn't want to become a pastor. But I also didn't know what other routes there were. And so I kind of went in with the like, okay, like I'm just going to follow the checklist, do the things. And there's a track in the United Methodist Church called the deacon track, which is still ordination status. It's just you're called a little bit more outside of the church. And so they're more like justice and service rather than just word and sacrament, like in church spaces.
hmm,
Um, and so yeah, I really kind of went through that discernment process of like, okay, I guess I'm gonna get ordained. I'm gonna follow all these things. And as I was doing that, the United Methodist Church, let's say I started seminary in fall of 2018. So the United Methodist Church was getting into furthering its anti-LGBTQ stuff in
mm,
2019. And so I remember, yeah, just like watching that special session go on and hearing these really like difficult things that people were saying about queer folks and queer ministers in particular, and just still like wrestling like with it. Is this still like the place in the institution that I want to align myself with? And yeah, over time kind of stuck with it. And then I think it really took me coming into my own like, yeah, gender identity and expression to say, like I don't think that this is the path for me. So when it comes to, I think institutionalized religion and institutionalized church, I have a lot of gratitude for how the United Methodist Church and the people that I've been in relationship in the UMC have really like shaped me and supported me. Um, and just like, how so many Methodists I know like live out their faith. And I think for me too, it's still also kind of like at the end of the day, I'm like, institutions are always gonna like stand in line with the institution. And I've witnessed that in response to, again, just the anti-LGBTQ policies, even though we did remove finally all of our harmful language in 2024.
Wow.
But we lost so many people along the way. And I just remember witnessing like, so much hurt and so much harm. And I think it's hard to like, to see that and then watch us take it away. And then kind of, I think for myself, kind of wondering like, where is this like restorative process to engage? And I think maybe we're still figuring that out. I think obviously there's so many other things going on in the world that like I don't know if that's like the highest priority, and I don't know if it needs to be, but
Well, but it feels like a microcosm of,
definitely,
or maybe a macrocosm, I'm not sure. I mean, it's so the both the pain and the irony of like the two things that you said that like felt really important to you about
mm-hmm.
your Methodist foundation, of like being connected to people, and that like feeling of like pervasive love that's available for us when we tap in, when we plug in. And that for people to leave the faith as a response to inclusion, which to me is like, inclusion is in a lot of ways like the place where connectedness and unconditional love meet, right? Like if we're all connected and there's a love available for all of us, then like the doors are open. It doesn't like, I have a hard time understanding them, and so like what a painful process that is. I mean, each for every individual, and especially for the folks who like, there's an inherent rejection and judgment in that. Anyway, it's just like sucks. Sucks.
And I mean, I think it was interesting too, because it's like, right, and the anti-LGBTQ stances were never like, as queer people, like you're not worthy of God's love. It was nothing like that, but it was like, in our book of discipline, which is the governing documents, the language in these social principles was every person is of like sacred worth. I think that was the language. I remember like sacred worth being a part of that. But we're not going to affirm same gender, same sex weddings, and we're not going to ordain self-avowed practicing homosexuals was the language that they used in the book of discipline, which was a choice. Part of me wants that on a t-shirt. I'm not gonna lie.
Self-avowed practicing homosexuals.
Right.
Practicing queer. Right, exactly. It's like, come on.
What does that mean? And so I think it was just interesting of this like, right, like in the United Methodist Church always being about like open hearts, open doors, open minds. And I feel like I experienced that. Like that's a part of my like, upbringing in the faith and the tradition. Like I didn't experience the anti-LGBTQ theology that a lot of folks get. And I think that's a really privileged experience of mine. And obviously it's really like kind of shaped my own, kind of path and faith in that as well. But and I think just like witnessing that and then kind of being like, okay, like as a denomination, like we're on board, like, right, like we know that everyone has sacred worth, and yet like we're still refusing to affirm the gifts and talents of like all queer people, LGBTQ people, still like refusing to affirm the like love and relationship of LGBTQ people, and obviously like we're on a new way, we're on a new path, which is exciting, which is really and great to see. But I think just witnessing too in that time of so many like radical queer like clergy and laity like really like pushing some like policy that wasn't like too bad, like they're like, right, the initial policy was just like, let's just like remove the language and like let's just like say like, right, like let's take it out and like all people are of sacred worth, like let's just affirm these things because that's what we're called to do. And I think what was hardest was just watching like so many people spend so much time, so much of their life and their ministry fighting the institution and then kind of getting shoved out. And the more I really and I remember how some key people that I like looked to, and I was like, oh, like these are the people that like I can see my, like, right, because of them I can see myself in ministry. I can see myself like in this community in the church, and none of those people are in the United Methodist Church anymore, either because their
Mm.
credentials were revoked, because they were queer clergy, or because they chose to leave the UMC. And so I think after watching them kind of leave, I was like, oh, maybe I can do that too. Like maybe there's also something out here for
Mm.
me. So yeah, that's kind of, yeah, I feel like a little all over, but in terms of just like the religious aspect for it, like I think I'm always gonna wrestle with institutional church, and I'm always like reluctant to call myself a Christian, but I know at the end of the day, like I really do follow like the gospel of Jesus and feel like called to like I feel more aligned with like, right, like what is it that Jesus has asked of me, as asked of all of us, than it is what is the like any Christian church asked of me, asked for us. And I'm always, I think, gonna be more likely to follow Jesus than I am an institution, while still holding, right, a lot of gratitude for what is like, and maybe not the institution itself, but I would say the community of people within this area of faith
Yeah.
have done and helped shaped me.
Yeah. The foundation. So, how would you describe your spiritual life today?
Yeah. Today it feels a little bit more contemplative, which I think has always kind of been true, and a lot more mystical. And I, yeah, have joked with my spiritual director that I feel like I've recently been initiated into mysticism, and just kind of like, right, like feeling these like really overwhelming and intense experiences with spirit, and just like, yeah, like just like feeling like this like level of intimacy with God and spirit that I don't know that I've ever like have felt to the same degree
Mm.
historically. Yeah, and I think that is just really interesting, because I don't think institutional, like I think institutional church has appreciation for mysticism, but like history of mystics, right, they're typically always kind of like outcasts. They're kind of looked to as like, what are you saying, like I don't know if you're like fully there, right? There's a little bit of kind of like, yeah, crazy labels, like stigma kind of applied to that, of
Yeah.
madness.
It's so interesting to me because like the mystical tradition across
Yeah.
the board, right? Like, you know, there are plenty of mystics in the East, that I've spent some time with, that it's almost like a mutual thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That like the institution is like, we don't know where to put you. You are talking about a relationship with God where we don't have a place as an institution, right? And that the mystics are also like, we don't need you. Like, fuck y'all. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't,
Totally.
it's me and my God over here. Like, we are having a really extraordinary experience. And like,
Yeah.
I also don't need to. It's such a, there's a wonderful poet, in the Eastern tradition whose name is Mirabai. And she basically says, like, I was born married to you. She's speaking like to the divine. I was born married to you, and they married me to this human person, but I am still married to you. I will be your bride until the day I die, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this like resolute sense of, that's the only thing that actually matters, is that like, the word you said is so perfect, intimate, that like intimate, extraordinary relationship that's available. Um, yeah. Um, you already said the world is complicated
Bonkers. Yeah.
right now at this
It's bad.
moment in time. In, yeah, November of 2025, the world is challenging in a lot of ways. You know, you have a really rich experience of faith. Like, is there a spiritual principle that is, you know, a go-to that's like an anchor for you in this time?
In this time, I mean, I think there are a few that come to mind, but I think the one that feels, yeah, most like, yeah, relevant as like that anchor is I always just come back to, and I think it's so hard, but I always come back to Jesus broke bread with Judas too. Um, so
Mm.
in the, right, in the gospel stories, when Jesus, yeah, sits to have the Last Supper with his disciples, with his friends, he knows that two of his disciples, Peter and Judas, were going to betray him. And in fact, before the supper, Judas had already gone to the priests and basically like, yeah, made the deal, exchanged the information, like agreed to out Jesus to the religious leaders, to essentially the police of the time, in exchange for like, I can't remember how much silver or whatever it was. And yet he, yeah, sits with his disciples, before he is to be like arrested and crucified. And he looks to them and he breaks bread and he drinks wine and he says, like, do this in remembrance of me. Like, this is my body, this is my blood, like, this is the covenant, like, this is what I'm like, yeah, what I am inviting you into is this like life of connection, this life of service, this life of like deep love and commitment for one another. And there's something in that, and I think especially over the past few years, like that, yeah, the communion aspect in the Christian church and in that story for me has just been so like overwhelmingly powerful in that, like, I think, right, like for me, like it feels really, really hard to be able to say like, oh, if I were to like sit at a table, like could I break bread with my quote unquote like enemies? Could I break bread with the people who have betrayed me? And I think that's always going to be something that I like wrestle with and struggle with. And I don't know if that like, if I even like need to do those things, right? Like at the end of the day, I think God's bigger than I am. And there are some things that I'm like fine with like letting God have. But when I think even just on like an interpersonal level, and so maybe if I'm not thinking of like, right, like breaking bread with politicians who don't care about queer and trans folks, I can look to, like who are like the people in my life that maybe I have felt betrayed by or felt hurt by, be it, right, like people in church context that I've had, right, conflict or in things like that with, and what does it look like to break bread with us as like peers and individuals and people in community and in connection with each other. And I think another kind of like aspect of that too, like for me, like just comes back to like how transformative I do really believe like the love of God, maybe of Jesus to be. And what like breaks my heart about that story is Judas never got to see the resurrection. He never got to witness Christ coming back, and he never got to trust, I think, that Jesus loved him anyway. And I know I haven't read a lot of the Gnostic Gospels, but I think there is a theory out there that like Judas betraying Jesus was actually like part of the plan, is something that I'd come across recently. And that's something that I also find really interesting, but still like for Judas to like be so, right, because this is like content warning for like mention of suicide, because he does go off and he kills himself after Jesus is arrested, betrayed, but he's like so racked with that guilt. And I can feel that, right, of kind of like, oh, when you've like messed up, done harm, made a mistake to someone, but he's like so racked in that guilt. And I think like, right, like Jesus is gonna be killed, like, and it feels absolutely like wild to even imagine that this guy is even gonna come back to life, and so he never gets to experience that like resurrection and that like love and forgiveness that I think that Jesus still would have obviously offered him, because that's what he was all about at the end of the day. So yeah, coming back to that again, I think just that idea of like Jesus broke bread with Judas too, for me is this like, and in that tether of really pulls me back to like, how can I lead with love? How can I, even in the face of so much violence, even in the face of so much like turmoil and chaos and harm, how can I not replicate those systems of oppression, violence, like, et cetera? How can I not replicate that in my interpersonal relationships? How can I keep showing up even when someone has made a mistake and maybe like hurt me or hurt my feelings, or cause even like greater harm, depending, right? And vice versa. Can I also offer that level of love and care and forgiveness to myself? And that feels, I think, right now, one of the hardest things to do in this time, and yet so important, because right when I look at like who our enemy is and who our enemies are, I don't think it's my neighbor who maybe voted for Trump. There's a relationship there that I think can like, right, maybe be fostered and cared for. And we have, I think, it feels really cliche, but I do think we have so much more in common than not. And not that I always live well into that, but I think that has always been the most challenging piece of like, Jesus broke bread with Judas too. How can I, continue to break bread with those around me?
Yeah, because that's not just like the people who believe differently from you.
Right.
And like the way for you moving in the world right now is much more complicated, than for, I can walk in the world and I just look like a spiritual white lady.
Sure.
It's like always, it's like, it's relatively safe for me.
Mhm.
Um, and so where like being my true self is not potentially harmful, right? Does not
Mhm.
put me at risk for the most part in any way. And so yeah, it's not just like, can you sit down and like look with love at the people who disagree with you? It's like, can you sit down and look with love at the people who potentially would cause you harm if
Mhm.
given the choice, And like that doesn't, what is it? How do we do that in a way that is honest and also does not, where we're not unnecessarily putting ourselves at risk, right? It's like,
Mhm.
how do we do that without, martyring ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like a real, yeah, that line is real
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Definitely. Yeah. And it feels like a balance. And right. Like, yeah, I just resonate with that kind of like, what does it look like to do so mindfully, to do so intentionally? Like, right. Like, I'm not trying to run out and martyr myself, but like, how do I like speak my truth? And I think especially as a queer and trans spiritual director who feels really called to not just working with queer and trans folks, but I think anyone who's like wrestling with kind of like, what is what is faith, what does spirituality look like in this time of like polycrisis, in this time of fascism? How can like spirituality help? And maybe I like won't speak for others, but I think for myself, like when I look to kind of what's happening in the world, I think there is like, right, like a little bit of a like crisis of faith of like, ooh, like everything we thought we knew for a lot of folks, I think is just like crumbling, right? Like we already moved through the first Trump administration, and yeah, obviously like Biden getting elected in 2020 or whatever, like didn't change anything. Like I've been right aware of like, oh, like all this stuff is gonna fall apart anyway, and none of these injustices just disappeared. But I think for folks who are like, oh, I thought we fixed it, and yet everything's still falling apart, and it's just
Yeah.
gonna keep getting like worse. I think like right like does call into like what like at least for me this question of like, oh my God, like is everything I know about God, is everything I know about Jesus, like religion, spirituality, whatever it be, like does any of it, and the world even, does any of it matter, and like what is it now? I think there's a lot of like room for like holding that space for people to move through a
Yeah.
lot of that grief. Yeah, and so just yeah, I think just coming back to then of like what does it look like to like still like yeah speak truth, because I know for myself again just as like a queer and trans spiritual director and theologian, like engaging with a little bit more radical like liberative theology feels scary sometimes. And like, how are people going to respond? What are they going to say? And not even right. Like some of the most progressive churches are always on board either,
Yeah.
which is, yeah, a challenge. But yeah, those are just a lot of questions, not a lot of
No, I mean, I
answers
think that that's a
necessarily.
like,
But
I I think that spirituality and spiritual practice inherently like makes us ask questions,
yeah.
and it rarely gives us answers other than love is available for you all the time
Mm-hmm.
if you will let it. I
Yeah.
feel like that's
Right.
maybe the only answer spiritual practice has ever given me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know. I'm just thinking about like you are hitting on like one of the reasons this project like of the podcast feels so important to me at this moment in time, which is that I think it is the world, like not just the United States, but the world is going to get harder in the next 10 years. Um, and hopefully it will get easier after that, but maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if I look back at like the long history of human struggle, uh, the way things are in the world at this very moment feel like the rule and not the exception,
Yeah.
right? And so what is missing in a really interesting way from so much of the conversation and the dialogue about this discourse about this is exactly that, is like as humans, as individual, you know self-reliant intellectual humans, uh we probably aren't going to make it. It's like
Totally.
it is bigger than this. And so finding a way to lean into the things that are bigger than
Mm-hmm.
this is like not just like pleasant and enjoyable, but essential, right? It's like if we're going to survive it, that's what we need.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the work that you're doing is really important, right? I think that like the more people who recognize that they're having those questions and those struggles, go like, where do I go from here?
Mm-hmm.
I think all of us need, I mean, you mentioned having your own spiritual director, right? Like same,
Yeah.
this is not a thing I can do by myself. And so having that kind of support and community and like the safe open space to be wrestling with those questions um, just feels essential for all of us right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is there anything else that
Yeah, I think like yeah, as you mentioned this like right like I can't do this on my own. And that's something right like I don't think right yeah, we are a species regardless of just like humans but also like live in a world right where like interdependence, interconnectedness is so like deeply woven into the fabric of like all the ecosystems, all the things that we live into. And I think yeah, just that reminder of like oh like I can't do this alone. And like right, I think one of the most powerful things that we can do in this time is like and I'm not the only person to say this. I'm following a lot of liberatory thinkers, Adrienne Reed Brown, Dean Spade, Miriam Kaba, Kelly Hayes, lots of others, just to name a few. But like I think one of the most powerful things we can do is to reach for one another, to build connection, and right just as much as we can outside of just our like internet screens, while also acknowledging that internet online friends is also connection for those like who otherwise can't find it in their community. And like yeah and that also means like beyond people like we also get to like yeah again like spirit to me is everywhere like I can make friends with the trees, I can make friends with the water, I can make friends with the birds, the plants, the bugs, whatever. And so yeah I think just kind of what that has sparked for me too is something I've been exploring lately is lady wisdom and God at the time of creation. Because right, we get into the book of Genesis and God talks about creating all these things, all the people, blah 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 blah, and God says about humankind, let us make them in our image. And I remember kind of reading that and always being like, oh, that's like really interesting. God's using this like plural tone. And then when I was in seminary, taking my Hebrew Bible course and reading the book of Proverbs, were revealed to Lady Wisdom, and I think it's Proverbs chapter 8, in which she acknowledges that she was actually with God at the time of creation. And so, what
Hmm.
we have in this story of Proverbs, of in like wisdom, it like revealing herself, acknowledging like yeah, like God didn't do this alone. What that has done for me, as far as it goes, like this like creation story is like there was mutuality from the beginning. There wasn't just God deciding like I think this river here will look nice, or I think this mountain range will be great. And obviously, like I'm engaging this in more of like a mythical, like folklore kind of way. Yeah, like as a great, like that's how the creation story is. Like for me, is in terms of like yeah, just another folk story of sorts. But it wasn't just God saying these things; it was God working with someone else to say, you know, like what about this? Does this work? Like should we do this? And then when it comes to kind of like yeah, being created as people, I think right. One of my other personal beliefs is that we are each like created in the image of God, and God is within us. The divine, the sacred, isn't within me; they're within you. They're within each of us. So how can I honor the divine and sacred within myself and others? But not only is God in us, but so is wisdom, and this like right core sense of like inner knowing, inner discernment, like ability and capability to like know what feels good, call it desire, call it pleasure, call it whatever. I'm still kind of I think in this exploration of like what does this like wisdom and God within kind of mean? But yeah, I think at the core of it that I'm kind of like running with and enjoying exploring lately is this like mutuality was present in the creation of the world of creation from the start.
Hmm.
And if that's how God started the world, God and wisdom created and started the world. Who's to say that we can't build new ones together? And it's gonna take right doing so with one another in deep
Together. Yeah.
relationship. Yeah, it's going to take that mutuality. So
I love that as a it's I mean again like I'm not a Christian theologian, I'm not a biblical scholar obviously, but it's interesting for me to think about the other like the parallel stories and other traditions that are that
yeah,
way, right? It's like
yeah,
that. um Also, one of the like intellectual exercises that I play with is it's really hard for me to conceive of one infinite being,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? Because like it's solitary, but it feels much more possible for me to relate to an infinite number of beings,
Yeah.
and that from a mathematical standpoint, like those, they're not different, right?
Sure.
um an infinite number of beings is the same as one infinite being, right? Because it's infinite. And so this notion of creation being co-creation, right? And often co-creation gets used in, the woo-woo, you know circles
Totally.
in a different kind of way, which I think is important, right? It's like thinking about, being in a boat with the divine, and like I have one oar, and they've got the other, and what happens now? um we both got to row
Yeah.
for us to get somewhere. But that, yeah, there is this like magic of what happens when more than one come together. And in practice, it's really hard. Like it's
Yeah.
really hard. Like if we're gonna like sit down and like we're two sort of separate beings, like what does it look like to create something together? Anyway, it's not easy. What It's always funny to me to like ask this question to people who are sort of in a spiritual profession.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what is your personal spiritual practice? What is a spiritual practice that is anchoring you right now, that feels really important?
Yeah. My spiritual practices definitely like move all around a little bit, but I think a core one that I keep coming back to feels a little bit newer, and I don't know like in and of itself if it's necessarily like right traditionally like a spiritual practice. But I stumbled into the world of generative somatics about a year ago, and so
Mm.
the practice of somatic centering in particular, of like really feeling into my length, width, and depth. And so those dimensions being length being dignity or self-worth, width being boundaries, like what are your, yeah, how much can I feel for myself, how much can I feel for other people, and then the depth being the backside, all that's come before, so ancestors, just yeah, anything that's come before me, and then the front being all that's yet to come, and then after engaging all those three, I think also in the dimension of depth is center, so like coming at like the center where all those things, for me it's like right under the navel of yeah, where all that energy kind of coalesced and sticks like in my being and in my own like centered self. And I think that has been just a really helpful practice and tool for getting out of my head and feeling into my body, or noticing just that I feel into my head, I think often. um, and then also, yeah, I think just really connecting, right? Like with myself, with, in that like, yeah, dimension of length, you're connecting, you're rooting deep down into earth, and then also like moving up into like the stars in the galaxy, and so kind of this like yeah, dual motion. Yeah, so how can I feel into the earth, how can I feel into the stars, into the spirit a little bit for me, not that it's always above. How can I feel for myself and for others, am I like, yeah, do I have big boundaries, are they closer, and then how am I connecting to the past and imagining the future, and where am I like finding it all in the present. And I think just
Mm.
having that like daily ish, I'm not super consistent, but consistent enough, but daily ish data to be like, okay, like this is how I'm showing up today. This is how I'm feeling. This is what's going on in my body. This is what's going on in my mind and my spirit. Has just been really helpful to, I think, just like, yeah, assess like day to day what's going on in the body,
Yeah.
in the spirit, and all that.
Yeah, we before we started recording, you said that you had a connection with Just Chang, and this like reconnection to embodiment
Mm.
as a spiritual practice. I mean, obviously, as a yoga teacher, that I'm like, well, duh. Um, but but it's so clear that like that is so much of the harm that happened in the history. I mean, my understanding of the history of the Christian church, right, is that specifically the Catholic Church, that I think it was when Da Vinci started studying the body,
Okay.
he went to the to the Pope to be like, is this okay? And the Pope was like, yes, you can study the body so long as you leave the spirit to us.
Mm.
And so there was this moment of like separation
Mm-hmm.
that potentially hadn't existed before then,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And then you have the Enlightenment, right, which then separates the
Totally.
mind from the body. And so like then we're in this state of fracture.
Yes.
And so yeah, that like that just the direct experience of, you know, and one of the things that Jess also said that I've heard you say is like, you know, sure, God created us in his image, but that the divine is inside of us.
Mm-hmm.
And like, what is that? How does that feel? What does it feel like, you know, to have the divine in your cells, and to remember in that kind of sensual way, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's, yeah. And when I think about the separation of those things and this, like, again, I think when I think of like the separation of all this and kind of my understanding and learning from more like, thinkers who are engaging from like a decolonization perspective or like indigenous
Yeah.
folks and teachings, like when we separate all these like parts of ourselves, like we're easier to control, right? If we're not in our bodies, if we don't know, like, what
Mm.
feels good, what feels bad, like if we just like take what people tell us, like we don't like, right? I think we're more likely to just go along with what everyone's saying.
Mm.
And yeah, I was really excited when you and Reverend Jessica Chang were talking about this in the other episode of kind of like, like this embodiment aspect, because like, I mean, like Jesus breaking the bread and pouring the wine is Jesus saying like that's Jesus saying like this is embodied, like my love for you is embodied and in my body. And so there was like, right, there was a little bit of metaphor, but it was also very literal because later he was going to be crucified. Like he gave his body to like the work of liberation in particular. And I actually think it's a intentional Christian mishap that we like frame it as like, oh, Jesus died for our sins. I don't think Jesus died for our sins. I think Jesus died because he was trying to like give us a world other than this like oppressive kind of empire that he was like living in. And it was these like, empirical leaders, etc., who put him on the cross. And at the end of the day, he
Right.
was,
Yeah. What's interesting is I go like, right, but that those are our sins,
right, yeah. And I
you
follow that line
know?
too of like, ooh, that's like the oops that we made. But how we engage it in like, Christian theology, I think is just like interesting. Cause I'm like, well, it's not like, I mean, it's kind of about the personal, right? And like, I think, as individuals, we have our own like learning to do, particularly of like I know for myself as like a white person, like how does like my own like whiteness show up and like, um, in relationship to others, and what does like kind of wrestling with that and unraveling some of that look like. And we can I think that follows across like all different points of like social location and privileges. But just coming back again to like, and when I think about like the life of Jesus, like Jesus in my kind of theology is God embodied. Like it's God took on human form to understand a little bit more about like what is this like human life like obviously Jesus still had some like magical mysticism in him, but I do think he was more human than he was God, in my own Christology. And so like what does it look like to really embody, to live into the gospel, and so when we're separated from those things and we're just like in the head rather than like right feeling it in the heart and like living into it, we miss, I think, so much of like what, and I know I've missed in my life like so much of what is like offered to me in that story and in that faith. But
Yeah. I keep thinking about Judas,
I think
because
about him all the
I
time.
didn't know that part, right? It's like so
Mm-hmm.
funny. I'm like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that that's how he died.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it tells you like I just am not a Christian.
Totally.
And the it's so clear, I think, in moments I have so much clarity that like all of these systems exist because individually we perpetuate them like on the
Mm-hmm.
inside, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And this notion, like when you were talking about like, right, yeah, it's like if you separate all of the pieces of the being, it's easier to control. I was like, oh right, divide and conquer, like that's
Mm-hmm.
the way. And so like what are the ways that I am separating myself. I'm like slicing off parts of myself in order to be um, accepted or passable or successful or whatever, the ways that I've done that in my life so far. And also the ways that it feels tempting to do that to others,
Mm-hmm.
you know, so that it's easier for me to figure out, you know, what to do now,
Yeah.
rather than letting every being be as complicated and as like messy and like blended as they are. Um, yeah, it's just sort of like one more layer. Feels like to me, it's a really interesting, and the thing about Judas, I think that forgiveness is like the advanced track.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's like the PhD level practice. Um, and that forgiving ourselves for the like really brutal things that we have done is often like the thing that actually stands in the way of us being with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and so like right, it's nice to have, those mythic stories that say like, and there is a part of us that is Judas who's made this terrible mistake, and rather than risk forgiveness and risk transcendence,
Mm-hmm.
we just cut ourselves off. We just go like,
Mm-hmm.
nope, not worthy.
Mm-hmm.
And how tempting that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts before we close today?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, yeah, I think this conversation has been really, really rich, really sweet, really great. And so I'm just really grateful. And yeah, I think my just like last maybe like offering is just like we're all like wrestling with questions and like the invitation to let ourselves wrestle with those, I think is really powerful. And so I think just, yeah, offering encouragement to listeners of like, if you're sitting with questions, like, let that be what comes. I know that's not always like the most comfortable place for people, but I've really learned, I think, in my own spiritual life, and I think in spiritual direction and accompaniment in particular, is like sometimes like yeah, questions are just the best place we can be. But
Yeah.
yeah, otherwise, I'm just really grateful for the conversation, and yeah, gratitude to those listening and tuning in. And yeah, this has been really, really awesome. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Court. I really appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in, Curious Hearts. If this episode was useful, I hope you'll follow the show or leave a review or share it with somebody who you think needs it. And if you're craving support on your own spiritual path or seeking some meaningful work, you can find ways to work with me at veralester.com. Otherwise, until next time, please stay grounded in that curiosity that you've got and keep turning towards what matters. See y'all soon.